Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in the New Science of Giambattista Vico. We are on Section 1, titled Notes on the Chronological Table, in which the materials are set in order. Section 1, and then there is a note in brackets which states, chronological table based on the three temporal epochs of the Egyptians, who said all the world before them had passed through three stages, that of gods, that of heroes, and that of men. Paragraph 43. This chronological table sets forth in outline the world of the ancient nations, starting from the universal flood and passing from the Hebrews through the Chaldeans, Scythians, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, down to the Second Punic War. On it there appear men and deeds of the greatest renown, assigned to certain times and places by the community of scholars. These men and deeds either did not have their being at the times or in the places to which they have been commonly assigned, or never existed at all. On the other hand, from the long dark shadows where they have lain buried, notable men and most pertinent facts emerge, through whom and by which the decisive changes in human affairs have come about. All this is set forth in these notes to show how uncertain, unseemly, defective, or vain are the beginnings of the nations. Paragraph 44. Moreover, this table takes a position quite opposed to that of the chronological canon, the canon chronicon Egyptian Hebraic Greek of John Marsham, in which he tries to prove that the Egyptians preceded all the nations of the world in government and religion, and that their sacred rites and civil ordinances transported to other peoples were received with some emendation by the Hebrews. In this opinion he was followed by John Spencer in his dissertation on the Urim and Thummim, in which he expresses the opinion that the Israelites had taken from the Egyptians all their science of divine things by means of the sacred Kabbalah. Finally, Marsham was acclaimed by Van Hern in his Antiquities of Barbarian Philosophy, in which, in the part entitled Chaldaicus, he writes that Moses, instructed in the knowledge of them by the Egyptians, had brought divine things to the Hebrews in his laws. Against this line of argument arose Hermann Witz in his Egyptian. He thinks that the first Gentile author to give us reliable information about the Egyptians was Dion Cassius, who flourished under the philosopher Marcus Aurelius. But on this point he may be confuted by the Annals of Tacitus, in which we are told that Germanicus, having gone into the East, proceeded thence to Egypt to see the famous antiquities of Thebes, and had one of the priests there interpret to him the hieroglyphs inscribed on some of the monuments. The priest, talking foolishly, told him that those characters preserved the memory of the boundless power that their king Ramses had held in Africa, in the East, and even in Asia Minor, equal to the power of the Romans in their own time, which was very great. But this passage, perhaps because it was contrary to his position, Witz said nothing about. Paragraph 45. But certainly such boundless antiquity did not yield much recondite wisdom to the inland Egyptians, for in the time of Clement of Alexandria, as he recounts in his Miscellanies, or Stromata, their so-called priestly books were in circulation to the number of 42, and they contained the greatest errors in philosophy and astronomy, for which Chaeremon, teacher of St. Dionysius the Areopagite, is often scoffed at by Strabo. Their ideas about medicine are found by Galen in his discussion of Hermetic medicine to be obvious nonsense and mere quackery. Their morality was dissolute, for it not only tolerated or permitted harlots, but made them respectable. Their theology was full of superstition, magic, and witchcraft, and the magnificence of their pyramids and other monuments might well have sprung from barbarism, which accords well with hugeness. Egyptian sculpture and casting are regarded even today as extremely crude. For delicacy is the fruit of philosophy, wherefore Greece alone, which was the nation of philosophers, shone with all the fine arts that human genius has ever discovered. Painting, sculpture, casting, and the arts of engraving, which are most delicate because they are compelled to abstract the surfaces of the bodies they represent. Paragraph 46. This ancient wisdom of the Egyptians was raised to the stars by Alexandria, founded on the sea by Alexander the Great. Uniting African acuteness with Greek delicacy, it produced distinguished philosophers and divinity, through whom the city gained such renown for high divine wisdom that the Alexandrian Museum was later as much celebrated as the Academy, the Lyceum, the Stoa, and the Cynosarges all together had been in Athens. Alexandria was called on this account the mother of the sciences. Such was its excellence that the Greeks called it simply Polis, the city, as Athens was called Astu, and Rome Urbs. Thence came Manetho, the Egyptian high priest, who turned all Egyptian history into a sublime natural theology, just as the Greek philosophers had previously done with their fables, which will here be found to have been their most ancient histories. This explains why the same thing happened to the Greek fables as to the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Paragraph 47. With such a show of high wisdom, the nation, arrogant by nature, and hence mockingly called animals of glory, in a city which was a great emporium of the Mediterranean, and through the Red Sea, of the ocean and the Indies, a city among whose abominable customs was that related by Tacitus in a golden passage that it was avid of new religions, believed that the false gods which were scattered abroad in the world, as they learned from the nations which met there for maritime trade, must have all originated in Egypt, and that their Jove Ammon was the oldest of all Joves, of which every Gentile nation had one, and that the Hercules of all the other nations, Varro enumerated as many as 40, must have taken their names from the Egyptian Hercules. These pretensions, both reported to us by Tacitus, were due in part to the prejudiced opinion of their exceptional antiquity, which they vainly boasted of all other nations of the world, adding that in ancient times they had lorded it over a great part of the world. They were due in part also to their not knowing the way in which uniform ideas of gods and heroes were born among the Gentile peoples without their having any knowledge of each other, as we shall fully demonstrate later on. Now, for all the too flattering judgments with which Diodorus Siculus, who lived in the times of Augustus, adorns the Egyptians, he does not accord them more than 2,000 years of antiquity, and his judgments are overthrown by Jacques Capel in his Historia Sacra et Exotica, who puts them in the same class with those which Xenophon had ascribed to Cyrus, and we may add those which Plato often feigns of the Persians. Finally, all this concerning the vanity of the high ancient wisdom of the Egyptians is confirmed by the hoax of Poimander, palmed off as Hermetic doctrine. Salames considered this fragment a disordered and badly composed collection of things, and Casaubon found that it contained no doctrine more ancient than that of the Platonists set forth in the same phraseology. Paragraph 48. This false opinion of their great antiquity was caused among the Egyptians by a property of the human mind, that of being indefinite, by which it is often led to believe that the things it does not know are vastly greater than in fact they are. The Egyptians were in this respect like the Chinese, who grew up into such a great nation, cut off from all foreign nations, for the Egyptians were similarly cut off from the Semiticus and the Scythians until Adanthrius. The latter, indeed, according to a vulgar tradition, surpassed the Egyptians in antiquity. This vulgar tradition must have taken its start from the legendary episode with which profane universal history begins. It sets up, in Justin's version, as two pre-beginnings, antedating the monarchy of the Assyrians, two powerful kings, Tanawus the Scythian and Sesostris the Egyptian, who have until now made the world seem older than it really is. The story goes that Tanawus had moved first through the east with a great army to subdue Egypt, which is by nature very difficult to penetrate with an army, and that then Sesostris, with an equally great host, had moved to subdue Scythia. Yet Scythia lived unknown to the Persians themselves, who had extended their monarchy over that of the Medes, their neighbors, down to the time of Darius, called the Great, who declared war on Edenthrus, king of the Scythians. And this king was so barbarous, even in the days of a most civilized Persia, that he answered him with 5 real words in the form of 5 objects, since he did not even know how to write with hieroglyphs. And we are to believe that these 2 great and mighty kings crossed Asia with 2 great hosts, without making it a province either of Scythia or Egypt, but leaving it in such liberty that there later grew up there the first of the 4 most famous monarchies in the world, that of Assyria. Paragraph 49. For the same reason, perhaps, the Chaldeans did not fail to enter the lists in this contest of antiquity. They too were an inland people, and as we shall show, more ancient than the other 2, who vainly boasted that they had preserved the astronomical observations of a good 28,000 years. This was perhaps the reason that Flavius Josephus the Jew erroneously regarded as antediluvian the observations described on the 2 columns, one of marble and one of brick, raised against the 2 floods, and thought that he himself had seen the marble one in Syria. So important was it to the ancient nations to preserve astronomical records, whereas this sense was quite dead among the nations that followed them. Wherefore this column finds its proper place in the Museum of Credulity. Paragraph 50. But the Chinese are found writing in hieroglyphs just as the ancient Egyptians did, to say nothing of the Scythians, who did not even know how to put their hieroglyphs in writing. For many thousands of years they had no commerce with other nations, by whom they might have been informed concerning the real antiquity of the world. Just as a man confined while asleep in a very dark room, in horror of darkness, on waking believes it certainly much larger than groping with his hands will show it to be, so in the darkness of their chronology, the Chinese and the Egyptians have done, and the Chaldeans likewise. It is true that Father Michel Ruggieri, a Jesuit, declares that he himself read books printed before the coming of Jesus Christ. It is true, further, that Father Martini, another Jesuit, in his Seneca Historia, ascribes a great antiquity to Confucius, which has led many into atheism, as we are informed by the Martin Schuck in his Diluvian Noachi Universale, in which he says that Isaac de la Perer, author of the Pre-Adamites, perhaps for that reason abandoned the Catholic faith, and then wrote that the flood spread over the lands of the Hebrews only. Nevertheless, Nicholas Tragolt, better informed than Ruggieri or Martini, writes in his On the Christian Expedition to China that printing was in use in China not more than 2 centuries earlier than in Europe, and that Confucius flourished not more than 500 years before Christ. And the Confucian philosophy, like the priestly books of the Egyptians, in its few references to physical nature, is crude and clumsy, and it turns almost entirely on a vulgar moral code, that is to say, on morals commanded to the people by laws. Paragraph 51. Premising such reflections on the vain opinion of their own antiquity held by these Gentile nations, and above all by the Egyptians, we should begin our study of Gentile learning, all that is known to the Gentile, by scientifically ascertaining this important starting point, where and when that learning had its first beginnings in the world, and by adducing human reasons thereby in support of Christian faith, all that is credible to the Christian, which takes its start from the fact that the first people of the world were Hebrews, whose prince was Adam, created by the true God at the time of the creation of the world. It follows that the first science to be learned should be mythology, or the interpretation of fables. For as we shall see, all the histories of the Gentiles have their beginnings in fables, which were the first histories of the Gentile nations. By such a method, the beginnings of the sciences, as well as of the nations, are to be discovered, for they sprang from the nations and from no other source. It will be shown throughout this work that they had their beginnings in the public needs or utilities of the peoples, and that they were later perfected as acute individuals applied their reflection to them. This is the proper starting point for universal history, which all scholars say is defective in its beginnings. Paragraph 52. In this undertaking we shall be greatly helped by the antiquity of the Egyptians, for they have preserved for us two great fragments not less marvelous than their pyramids, namely these two great philological verities. The first is narrated by Herodotus, that the Egyptians reduced all the preceding time of the world to 3 ages, the first that of the gods, the second that of the heroes, the third that of men. The other, as related in Scheffer's On the Nature and Constitution of Italian or Pythagorean Philosophy, is that, with corresponding number and sequence, through all that period 3 languages had been spoken. The first hieroglyphic, with sacred characters, the second symbolic, with heroic characters, the third epistolary, with characters agreed on by the people. This division of time was not followed by Marcus Terentius Varro. We must not say because he did not know of it, for with his boundless erudition he deserved the honor bestowed on him in the title Most Learned of the Romans, and their most enlightened period, the age of Cicero, but rather because he did not choose to, perhaps because he applied only to Roman history what by our principles will be found true of all the ancient nations, namely that all Roman things, divine and human, were native to Latium. He therefore studied to give them all Latin origins in his great work on things divine and human, Antiquitates, of which the injustice of time has deprived us. Yet Varro believed in the legendary bringing of the law of the 12 tables from Athens to Rome. He divided the times of the world into 3, a dark age, corresponding to the Egyptian age of the gods, a fabulous age, corresponding to their age of the heroes, and a historic age, corresponding to their age of men. Paragraph 53. Furthermore, the antiquity of the Egyptians will help us with 2 pretentious memories, examples of that national self-conceit by which, as Diodorus Siculus observed, every nation, barbarian or civilized, has considered itself to be the oldest, and to have preserved its records from the beginning of the world, a privilege, as we shall see, of the Hebrews alone. These 2 pretentious memories we have observed to be, first, the legend of their Jove Ammon, was the oldest of all the Joves in the world, and second, that the Herculeses of all the other nations had taken their name from the Egyptian Hercules, that is, that all nations had passed first through the age of gods, the king of whom was by all these nations held to be Jove, and then through the age of heroes, who were considered sons of the gods, and of whom Hercules was believed to be the greatest. 2. On the Hebrews. Paragraph 54. The first column is dedicated to the Hebrews, who, on the most reliable authority of Flavius Josephus, the Jew, and Lactantius Firmianus, to be cited later, lived unknown to all the Gentile nations. And yet they reckoned rightly the account of the times passed through by the world, now accepted as true by the severest critics, according to the calculation of Philo the Jew. If his estimate varies from that of Eusebius, the deviation is one of a mere 1,500 years, which is a very short period of time compared with the variations among the calculations made by the Chaldeans, Scythians, Egyptians, and in our own day by the Chinese. And this should be an invincible proof that the Hebrews were the first people in our world, and that in the sacred history they have accurately preserved their memories from the very beginning of the world. Section 3, on the Chaldeans. Paragraph 55. The second column is devoted to the Chaldeans, both because in geography it is clear that the most inland monarchy of all the habitable world must have been in Assyria, and because in this work it is shown that the inland nations were populated first, and then the maritime nations. And certainly the Chaldeans were the first Gentile sages, and the common opinion of theologians regarded Zoroaster the Chaldean as their prince. And without question, the universal history takes its beginning from the monarchy of the Assyrians, which must have begun to take shape among the Chaldean people, from whom, when it had grown to great size, it must have passed to the nation of the Assyrians under Ninus, who must have founded that monarchy not with people brought in from the outside, but with those born within Chaldea itself, whereupon he did away with the Chaldean name and brought forward the Assyrian in its stead. It must have been the plebeians of that nation, through whose support Ninus made himself king. It will be shown in this work that such was the political custom in almost all nations, as we know certainly it was of the Roman. Now the same universal history tells us that Zoroaster was slain by Ninus. We shall see that this was said in heroic language, in the sense that the kingdom of the Chaldeans, which had been aristocratic, and of which Zoroaster had been the heroic character, was overthrown by means of the popular liberty of the plebeians of that people. We shall see that in heroic times these plebeians were a different nation from the nobles, and that with the aid of this nation Ninus established himself as monarch. Otherwise, if things are not as we have stated them, this monster of chronology would emerge in Assyrian history, that within the lifetime of one man, Zoroaster, Chaldea had grown from a land of lawless vagabonds to such greatness of empire that Ninus was able to found on it a mighty monarchy. For lack of these principles, Ninus, taken as the initiator of universal history, has hitherto made the monarchy of Assyria seem to have been born all at once, as a frog is born in a summer shower. 4. On the Scythians. Paragraph 56. The third column is set up for the Scythians, who surpassed the Egyptians in antiquity, as we learned not far back, paragraph 48, from a vulgar tradition. 5. On the Phoenicians. Paragraph 57. The fourth column is assigned to the Phoenicians, rather than to the Egyptians, to whom the Phoenicians brought from the Chaldeans the use of the quadrant, and the knowledge of the elevation of the pole. Of so much there is a vulgar tradition. We shall show later that they brought also vulgar alphabetic characters. Section 6 on the Egyptians. Paragraph 58. For all the reasons discussed above, the Egyptians, to whom Marsham in his canon accords the distinction of being the most ancient of all nations, merit the fifth place in our chronological table. Section 7. On Zoroaster, or the Kingdom of the Chaldeans, Year of the World 1756. Paragraph 59. Zoroaster is shown in this work to have been a poetic character of founders of peoples in the East. There are as many of these founders scattered throughout the great part of the world as there are Herculeses scattered throughout the opposing part, the West. And perhaps the Herculeses, whom Varro observed to exist in the likeness of the Western ones, even in Asia, such as the Tyrian or Phoenician, must have been considered by the Easterners as so many Zoroasters. But the vanity of scholars, who will have it that whatever they know is as ancient as the world, has made of them one individual man brimming with the highest esoteric wisdom, and has attached to him the oracles of philosophy, which do nothing but palm off as ancient a very modern doctrine, namely that of the Pythagoreans and the Platonists. But this vanity of the scholars did not stop here, for it swelled even further by deriving from him the scholastic succession among the nations. According to them, Zoroaster taught Berosus for Chaldea, Berosus Hermes Trismegistus for Egypt, Hermes Trismegistus Atlas for Ethiopia, Atlas Orpheus for Thrace, and finally Orpheus founded his school in Greece. But we shall shortly see how far from easy these long journeys were for the ancient nations, who, because of their recent savage origin, lived everywhere unknown, even to their nearest neighbors, and came to know each other only by occasion of war or by reason of trade. Paragraph 60. But concerning the Chaldeans, the Phologians themselves, confused by the various vulgar traditions which they have themselves collected, do not know whether they were individual men or entire families, or a whole people or nation? All these doubts will be resolved by the following principles. They were first individuals, then entire families, later a whole people, and finally a great nation on which the monarchy of Assyria was founded. Their wisdom was at first in vulgar divinity, by means of which they divined the future from the path of falling stars at night, and then in judicial astrology. Thus, among the Latins, a judicial astrologer was still called a Chaldean. 8. Iapetus, from whom spring the giants. Year of the world 1856. Paragraph 61. Giants, as we shall show by physical histories found in the Greek fables, and by proofs, both physical and moral, drawn from civil histories, existed in nature among all the first Gentile nations. 9. Nimrod, or the confusion of tongues. Year of the world 1856. Paragraph 62. The confusion of tongues came about in a miraculous way, so that on the instant many different languages were formed. The Fathers will have it that through this confusion of tongues the purity of the sacred antediluvian language was gradually lost. This should be understood as referring to the languages of the eastern peoples, among whom Shem propagated the human race. It must have been otherwise in the case of the nations of all the rest of the world, for the races of Ham and Japheth were destined to be scattered through the great forest of this earth in a savage migration of 200 years. Wandering and alone, they were to bring forth their children with a savage education, destitute of any human custom, and deprived of any human speech, and so in a state of wild animals. It was necessary that just so much time should pass before the earth, having at last dried off from the wetness of the universal flood, could send off dry exhalations of the sort wherein lightning could be generated, which stunned and terrified men into abandoning themselves to the false religions of so many Joves that Varro was able to count 40 of them, and the Egyptians claimed that their Jove Ammon to be the oldest of all. They turned to a kind of divination which consisted in dividing the future from the thunder and lightning and from the flights of eagles, with which they held to be birds of Jove. But among the Easterners there was born a more refined divination from the observation of the movements of the planets and the aspects of the stars. Thus Zoroaster is honored as the first wise man among the Gentiles. Bochart gives him the title Contemplator of the Stars. Just as the first vulgar wisdom was born among the Easterners, so also among them rose the first monarchy, that of Assyria. Paragraph 63. This chain of reasoning disposes of all those recent etymologists who attempt to trace all the languages of the world back to the origins of the Eastern tongues. The fact is that all the nations sprung from Ham and Japheth first developed their native languages inland, and only then, having descended to the sea, began to deal with the Phoenicians, who were famous for navigation and colonies along the shores of the Mediterranean and of the ocean. We have shown in the first edition of our new science that this is true of the origins of the Latin language, and that by analogy with the Latin it must hold for all the others as well. Section 10. One of these giants, Prometheus, steals fire from the sun. Year of the world 1856. Paragraph 64. From this fable we perceive that heaven reigned on earth, when it was believed to be no higher than the mountain tops, according to the vulgar tradition that also tells that it left great and numerous benefits to the human race. Section 11. Deucalion. Paragraph 65. In those times, Themis, or divine justice, had a temple on Mount Parnassus, and she judged on earth the affairs of mortals. Section 12. Hermes Trismegistus, the Elder, or the Egyptian Age of the Gods. Paragraph 66. This is the Hermes who, on the authority of Cicero, on the nature of the gods, was called by the Egyptians Thoth or Thuth, from which the Greeks are said to have derived Theos, and who brought the Egyptians letters and laws. They in turn, according to Marsham, taught them to the other nations of the world. But the Greeks did not write their laws with hieroglyphs, but with vulgar letters, which up to now Cadmus has commonly been thought to have brought to them from Phoenicia, though, as we shall see, they made no use of them for 700 years, and more thereafter. For within this period there came Homer, who in none of his poems so much as mentions nomos, as Fieth observed in his Antiquitates Homericae, and who left his poems to the memory of his rhapsodies, because in his time vulgar letters had not been discovered, as Flavius Josephus, the Jew, resolutely maintains against Appian, the Greek grammarian. Moreover, after Homer, Greek letters turned out so different from the Phoenician. Paragraph 67. But these are minor difficulties by comparison with the following. How can there be nations already founded and yet without laws? And how within Egypt itself, before this Hermes, had the dynasties been founded? As if letters were essential to laws, and as if the laws of Sparta were thus not laws, where a law of Lycurgus himself forbade the knowledge of letters. As if the following order were impossible in civil nature, to devise laws orally, and orally to publish them. As if we did not in fact find in Homer two sorts of assembly. One, called boule, secret, where the heroes met to consult by word of mouth about the laws, and another called the agora, public, in which, also by word of mouth, the laws were published. And as if, finally, Providence had not made provision for this human necessity, so that lacking letters, all nations in their barbarian period were first founded on customs, and only later, having become civilized, were governed by statutory laws. Just as in the second barbarian period, the first laws of the new nations of Europe were born in customs, of which the feudal are the most ancient. This should be remembered because of what we shall have to say later, that fiefs were the first origins of all the laws that grew up later among all nations, both ancient and modern, and hence the natural law of nations was established not with statutory laws, but with these same human customs. Paragraph 68. Now as to what touches on that great theme of the Christian religion, that Moses did not learn from the Egyptians the sublime theology of the Hebrews, there seems to be one great obstacle, chronology, which places Moses after Hermes Trismegistus. But this difficulty, besides being met by the reasons set forth above, is completely overcome by means of the principles expressed in a really golden passage of Iamblichus on the mysteries of the Egyptians, where he says that the Egyptians ascribed to this same Hermes all they discovered that was necessary or useful to human civil life. He must therefore have been not an individual man rich in esoteric wisdom who was subsequently made a god, but a poetic character of the first men of Egypt, who were wise in vulgar wisdom, and who founded there first the families and then the peoples that finally went to make up this great nation. From this same passage, just cited from Iamblichus, it follows that, if the Egyptian division stands of the three ages of gods, heroes, and men, and their Trismegistus was a god, then the life of this Hermes must embrace the entire Egyptian age of the gods. Section 13. The Golden Age, or the Greek Age of the Gods. Paragraph 69. Legendary history acquaints us with one of the peculiarities of this age, namely that the gods associated with the men on earth. To give certainty to the principles of chronology, we shall consider in this work a natural theogony, or generation of the gods, formed naturally in the imagination of the Greeks on certain occasions of human need or utility, in which they felt they had received help or comfort in the early childhood of the world, when it was overwhelmed by most frightful religions. For whatever men saw or imagined, or even did themselves, they took to be divinity. Now by making 12 short epochs of the 12 famous Gentile gods, who were called greater, that is, the gods consecrated by men in the time of the families, a rational chronology of poetic history leads us to assign to the age of the gods a duration of 900 years. This gives us the beginnings of universal profane history. Section 14. Hellen, son of Deucalion, grandson of Prometheus, great-grandson of Iapetus, through his 3 sons, spreads 3 dialects in Greece. Year of the world 2082. Paragraph 70. From this Hellen the native Greeks were called Hellenes, but the Greeks of Italy were called Graii, and their land Graacia, whence they were called Graci by the Latins. So well did the Greeks of Italy know the name of the mother country beyond the sea, whence they had come as colonists into Italy. For no such word as Graacia is found in any Greek writer, as Jacques Le Palmière observes in his description of ancient Greece. Section 15. Cecrops the Egyptian brings 12 colonies into Attica, of which Theseus later makes up Athens. Paragraph 71. When Strabo judges on the contrary that Attica, because of his rocky soil, could not attract foreigners to come and live there, he does so in order to support the further assertion that the Attic dialect is one of the first among the native dialects of Greece. Section 16. Cadmus the Phoenician founds Thebes and Boeotia and introduces vulgar letters into Greece. Year of the world 2491. Paragraph 72. Since he introduced the Phoenician alphabet there, Boeotia should have been from its illiterate beginnings the most ingenious of all nations of Greece. But it produced men of such doltish minds that Boeotian became a proverbial term for a man of slow wit. Section 17. Saturn, or the Latin Age of the Gods. Year of the world 2491. Paragraph 73. This is the age of the gods beginning among the nations of Latium, and corresponding in character to the golden age of the Greeks, among whom our science of mythology will show that the first gold was grain, by the harvest of which many centuries the first nations counted their years. Saturn was called by the Latins from satai, sown fields, and is called Chronos by the Greeks, among whom Chronos means time, whence comes the word chronology. Section 18. Hermes Trismegistus the Younger, or the Egyptian Age of the Heroes. Year of the world 2553. Paragraph 74. This Hermes the Younger must be a poetic character of the Age of the Heroes of Egypt. This age in Greece comes only after an age of the gods lasting 900 years. But among the Egyptians, the age of the gods lasts only through the time of a father, son, and grandson. Corresponding to this anachronism in Egyptian history, we have already noticed a similar one in Assyrian history, the case of Zoroaster. Section 19. Danaus the Egyptian drives the Enochids out of the kingdom of Argos. Year of the world 2553. Paragraph 75. These royal successions are great canons of chronology. Thus Danaus occupies the kingdom of Argos, which had previously been ruled by 9 kings of the house of Inachus, during whose time there must have passed 300 years, according to the rule of the chronologers, as there must have passed nearly 500 years during the time of the 14 Latin kings who reigned in Alba. Paragraph 76. But Thucydides says that in heroic times the kings drove one another off the throne almost daily, as Amulius drives Numitor from the kingdom of Alba, and Romulus then dethrones Amulius and restores Numitor. This came about through the savagery of those times, and also because the heroic cities were without walls, nor were fortresses then in use. We shall see later that this was true also of the second barbarian period. Section 20. The Heraclids spread abroad through Greece, bring in the age of the heroes there, Curites in Crete, and Saturnia or Italy, and in Asia bring in the kingdom of priests. Year of the world 2682. Paragraph 77. These 2 great fragments of antiquity, as Denis Patois observes, fall in Greek history before the heroic age of the Greeks. The Heraclids, or sons of Hercules, are scattered abroad through Greece, more than 100 years before the coming of Hercules their father, whereas in order to propagate so many descendants, he would have had to be born many centuries earlier. Section 21. Dido of Tyre goes to found Carthage. Paragraph 78. We place here at the end of the heroic age of the Phoenicians, and thus conceive her to have been driven out of Tyre, because she had been conquered in a heroic contest, as she professes to have left the city on account of the hatred of her brother-in-law. This multitude of Tyrian men was called in heroic diction a woman, because it was made up of the weak and vanquished. This is the end of what will comprise 2 videos, which will span Section 1, entitled Notes on the Chronological Table, in which the materials are set in order. We have read paragraphs 43 through 78. Thank you for listening.